It's 8:59 here by my time. I think we have 1 more minute to begin our webinar. So I'll entreat all of you here to hold on for a few more seconds so that more people can join us today. Okay, it's 9 o'clock on the dot, and I know it's 3 o'clock on the dot in Europe, so we can begin our webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. You're welcome to today's webinar on a critical topic that has a profound impact on global peace and security: the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, nuclear weapon-free zones. And today we are going to zone in on the Pelindaba Treaty, which is bordering on the African Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. My name is Yai Nimau Parapia, and I'm privileged to be your moderator for this session. I'm a member of the Women in Nuclear Global, but with the Win for Peace wing. And you hear more about it from our next speaker, Eva Jani, who is ahead. So without further ado, I will entreat Eva to give us what she has planned for us. Stay tuned and please ask any questions you might have in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or you can put your questions in the chat box. Eva, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Anima. I welcome all of you to our Win for Peace webinar. I'm really proud of my young ladies here who are taking over as moderators and presenters. So I would really like to applaud them for that. So we have 3 young speakers here from our group. And moreover, we have 2 illustrious speakers whom I know from my past at the IAEA. Anima will introduce them later on. Before we start, I would just like to give a brief overview of who we are, Win for Peace, and what we do. So without further ado, here is Win for Peace. We founded this group of expertise more than a year ago with the objective to contribute towards peace in this world by involving more women in our 4 key subject areas, which are nuclear non-proliferation, safeguards, export controls, and disarmament. And we conduct coordinated activities across those 4 domains. In particular, we want to do education and training by holding webinars and, if possible, hybrid events. The membership to our group is open to all WIN global members. We currently have 25 members from 4 continents, and I am the leader. And here is a photo of all our members. So if you would like to join, please, you are most free to contact me. We also have 2 major supporters. One is the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and the other one is the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, and both are based in Vienna. We gave a number of webinars last year, and here you can see the topics. I'm not going to read them out to you. We had a total of 555 registered participants and 358 unique viewers from all continents. And if you want to listen to some of those webinars, you can find the recordings on our WIN Global YouTube channel. And also this webinar is going to be recorded and posted there. We announce our webinars on social media via Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and also via email if you have already participated in one of our webinars. And as I said, it's open for anybody to join, so you're most welcome to join, and we all hope that you will have a benefit from this. And let's now look at 2024. We have so far conducted 5 webinars, starting from nuclear weapons basics with Bob Kelly, a former IAEA colleague. We have also looked at how to safeguard SMRs with one of our young members, and Adjoa and Jeremy Whitlock from the IAEA. I spoke about the nuclear fuel cycle in April. In May, we had Rhonda Evans here from WINS talking about cybersecurity and nuclear security in general. Last month, we had our Professor Nusha Ben Rais from Morocco talking about nuclear physics basics. And here we are at our webinar number 6 on the, part 1 of the nuclear weapons-free zones, where we will talk about the Treaty of Pelindaba. Next month, we will have Susie Snyder from the TPNW to talk about from ICANN to talk about the treaty on the prohibition for nuclear weapons. In September, we will have a talk about the CTBT and the CTBTO. And in October, sometimes the date has not yet been fixed. We plan to launch part 2 of the nuclear weapons-free zone treaties, talking about the treaties of Tlatelolco and Rarotonga. And without any further ado, let me now hand back to Enima to introduce the speakers. And I wish you all good luck. Don't be nervous. You will do very well, I'm 100% sure.
Thank you, Eva. That was an eye-opening expose, and I personally invite all of you to join our Win for Peace group. It's great. It's a great learning opportunity for you. Okay, so next on our agenda we have a seasoned speaker. Her name is Miss Madame Razan. Razan Mutadi is a radiation biologist working at the Federal Armed Forces Institute of Radiobiology, and her areas of specialization include molecular histology and genomics in the field of radiation biology. Razan's academic career began with a bachelor's degree in chemistry, followed by a master's in radiation biology at the Technical University of Munich. So you can imagine how well versed in her area she is. Currently, Razan Muhtadi is pursuing a doctoral research at the same institution, which is the Technical University of Munich. Razan is diving into the complex field of radiation biology and oncology. She is driven by her passion for advancing scientific knowledge. Please stay tuned as Razan gives us what she has for us, and I promise you it's going to be very eye-opening. You can put all your questions in the chat box, or you can utilize the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Razan, please, the floor is yours. Razan, we can't hear you.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
Great.
I think you can
Hi.
hear me now, right?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Thank you, Yanima, for the kind introduction. And thank you all for you joining our first webinar on nuclear weapon-free zones. Today, I will explore with you what are these zones, their significance, the existing examples, and the key characteristics and requirements of nuclear weapon-free zones, and some of the challenges that they may face. So let's start with a brief introduction. What are nuclear weapon-free zones? Actually, these are regions where the development, testing, acquisition, and deployment of nuclear weapons are prohibited. The idea behind the nuclear weapon-free zones emerged during the Cold War as a way to promote peace and stability and to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. These zones are established through formal treaties and agreement among the participating states within a defined areas. History and nuclear weapon-free zones around the world. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, was a pioneering agreement that established the first nuclear weapon-free zone, prohibiting nuclear weapons and any military activities on the continent. The first regional nuclear weapon-free zone was created with the Treaty of Tlatelolco in 1967, which covered Latin America and the Caribbean. Actually, this treaty set a significant model, inspiring other regions to follow it. In 1985, the Treaty of Rarotonga established a nuclear weapon-free zone in the South Pacific. Following that, we have the Treaty of Bangkok in the southeast of Asia, then the Treaty of Pelindaba in Africa. Mr. Vanzi will talk about it in more details. And more recently, the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, which is established in 2006. Additionally, Mongolia declared itself as a single-state nuclear weapon-free zone. A status was recognized by the United Nations in 1998. This map highlights the global distribution of the zones. As you can see, the blue color represents regions where nuclear weapons are prohibited by treaty, which covers most of the southern hemisphere and some parts of Asia. Then we have the red color, which represents the nuclear weapon states, includes the major powers like the US and Russia, China, and the others. Then we have also the orange color, which resembles the nuclear sharing states, primarily the NATO member states. And finally, the yellow color, it's a very, not that big one, the countries that are part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Okay, coming now to the objectives of nuclear weapon-free zones. The foremost objective of a nuclear weapon-free zone is non-proliferation, which can be achieved by prohibiting the development, testing, deployment of nuclear weapons in the designated regions. Another key objective is the global disarmament. Nuclear weapon-free zones aim to reduce and eventually eliminate existing nuclear arsenals as a step toward a world free of nuclear weapons. They also promote regional peace and security by reducing the risk of conflict and building trust among neighboring states. Additionally, nuclear weapon-free zones have significant humanitarian benefits. These zones actually help to safeguard human lives and to protect the environment from a devastating effects of nuclear explosions or from radioactive fallout. Next, I want to talk about the key characteristics and requirements of nuclear weapon-free zones. First, they are established through formal treaties agreed upon the member states. Treaties outline specific obligations, prohibitions related to nuclear weapons. Each zone has clearly defined its geographical boundaries where the treaty applies, covering land, airspace, and territorial waters. And of course, the core of these treaties is the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Then we have verification and compliance mechanisms are set up to ensure adherence to these prohibitions, often involving inspections by international bodies like the IAEA. Despite the benefits of nuclear weapon-free zones, they may face some difficulties and challenges. For example, compliance and verifications are major issues, as ensuring that all members adhere to the treaty can be difficult. Then we have the influence of nuclear-armed states can also be a significant barrier, as these countries may resist or undermine nuclear weapon-free zones efforts. And the geopolitical tensions and conflicts within and between regions can undermine the effectiveness of nuclear weapon-free zones. Finally, I would like to mention the future prospects and expansions. Looking ahead, there are proposals to establish nuclear weapon-free zones in regions like the Middle East, Northeast Asia, and etc. Then strengthening the existing nuclear weapon-free zones by improving verification and compliance mechanisms is also crucial. International organizations like the United Nations and the IAEA can play a vital role in supporting nuclear weapon-free zones. And finally, these zones fit into broader global disarmament initiatives, and expanding them is essential for a nuclear-free world. By this, I finish my introduction. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Razan. I have two questions for you, but I'm going to ask you during the Q&A session. So get ready.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much for your introduction. Zeal. Mr. Vio van Zilier has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Johannesburg. I hope you can all hear me.
Yeah, that's fine.
Can you hear me? Great.
Yes, there's been some adjustment, but now it's fine.
Okay. His early career as a researcher started at the former South African Atomic Energy Board. Thereafter, he occupied various middle, senior, and executive management positions at the Atomic Energy Corporation, renamed later as NEXA, all the way up to 2013. His responsibilities included research and development, nuclear services, international collaboration and strategy. He performed many expert missions for the IAEA. From 2013 to 2022, he was a director of an operations division in the Department of Safeguards at the IAEA in Vienna. I just learned this morning that he was a colleague of uh, Win for Peace head, Ivajani. So that is great to know. The division was responsible for safeguards implementation in more than 100 countries, including all of Africa except South Africa. Currently, he is a consultant on nuclear non-proliferation, safeguards, and peaceful applications of nuclear technology. I don't know a better person to introduce this topic to us. So, Mr. Brian Van Zyl, thank you for having the time to introduce this topic to us. Please take it away. Go on, please.
Yes, I'm going. Let's see. Okay, there we go.
Great.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody. And yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to share a few ideas. Can you hear me? Is it fine?
Yes, we can.
And see my screen. Good. Yeah, well, thank you very much. And thanks also for Razan for a very, very good introduction of the whole landscape of the nuclear weapon-free zone treaties. And I will now endeavor to tell you something more about the one closer to home for the continent of Africa. And I think it's important to always look at where do these things come from? How has it started for Africa specifically? And interesting enough, already in 1961, you may be aware that from 1960, France started doing some nuclear weapon tests in the south of Algeria. And that immediately led to some African leaders speaking out against that. And then in 1961, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution on that it should be considered to declare Africa a denuclearized zone. Later on in 1965, 1964, at the time, in the early days of the Organization for African Unity, the OAU, all the heads of state then accepted a declaration where they basically declared themselves willing to adhere to a treaty to be developed that would cover and make provision for the denuclearization of Africa. And then, as you know, in the 1960s, later various discussions started, and which led to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, entering into force in 1970. During that time, I think African countries were very involved, leaders were very involved in working on the NPT and its implementation thereof. Then in the late 1980s, with the various changes happening in my country, in South Africa, led to, in 1991, South Africa acceded to the NPT, which then gave kind of a new impetus to resume the discussions on a nuclear weapon-free zone treaty for the African continent. And then the OAU and the UN established a joint group of experts to actually draft a treaty. So they worked on that over a period of 4 years, and that culminated with the last discussions in mid-95 in Johannesburg, and then also at Pelindaba, which is the nuclear research site just west of Pretoria. And then that became actually the informal name of this treaty. So the text of the treaty was then accepted by mid-95. And then in April 96, the treaty was opened for signature on the 11th of April 1996. And there was also then the so-called Cairo Declaration, where heads of African states declared themselves to pursue the objectives of the treaty, but also to participate in the global discussions on non-proliferation and disarmament. So then the good news was it took a while, but then on the 15th of July 2009, the Pelindaba Treaty actually entered into force as the treaty provides for when the 28th ratification, which happened to be that by Burundi, would enter it into force, and that happened then in 2009. The contents of the treaty covers all the fields that Rosanna has mentioned before, a number of articles and annexes and protocols, and I will briefly go through all of them. The depository, as the case is for any treaty of this nature, there needs to be a depository. That originally was the OAU Commission. Now, obviously, it's been succeeded by the African Union. So now the African Union Commission chair is the repository of the treaty. Currently, there are 52 signatories, and there's already been 4 ratifications of the treaty. And I think it is important to mention that the Pelindaba Treaty actually supports all 3, the so-called pillars of the NPT, meaning disarmament, non-proliferation, as well as the peaceful uses of nuclear technology. And so I will now kind of just briefly cover the articles of the African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty, the Pelindaba Treaty, as it's known most of the time. As always, early in the treaty, a number of definitions and terms are clarified, as in any other arrangement of this nature. Sorry, that was too quick. Then the article covers the application, the area that is covered by this treaty. That basically is the whole of Africa and a range of islands near and sometimes not so near the continent of Africa. And that is clearly defined at the time by the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, and currently the African Union. Important then, Article 3 announces the development, research on the encouragement of anything related to nuclear explosive devices, meaning where states commit themselves not to develop and not to collaborate or not to encourage others to develop anything of that nature. Article 4 covers the prevention of the stationing of nuclear explosive devices, meaning from any other state to be stationed in the continent of Africa or the entire area covered by the Pelindaba Treaty. Article 5 prohibits the testing of nuclear explosive devices by any of the parties, but also any, again, collaboration or encouragement of testing of nuclear explosive devices in the area covered by the Pelindaba Treaty. Article 6, and with this asterisk, I've just indicated a few of the articles where there's a kind of a unique or a special or a stronger component to the Pelindaba Treaty when compared to the other nuclear weapon-free zone treaties. And an important one here is that the provision, I think the drafters of the treaty really took it a step further towards disarmament, where they specified in Article 6 that any existing nuclear explosive devices should be declared, dismantled, and destroyed, and also so the facilities for their manufacture. And now, as you may know, that at the time, South Africa had already done that in the early 1990s. So by the time of the entry into force, or long before that, this was applicable. And you will also know that, for instance, in Libya, there were the early stages of a nuclear weapon program. So a very important step further taken by the drafters of this treaty. Article 7, also the prohibition of dumping of radioactive wastes in line with the Bamako Convention, which prohibits the acceptance in Africa of hazardous waste from other places in the world. Article 8, an important one, very strong, on the promotion of the peaceful uses of nuclear activities, with a heavy emphasis on cooperation among the state parties, but also with others and other organizations in the world, for instance, through the technical cooperation program of the IAEA, and specifically is mentioned AFRA, the African Regional Cooperative Agreement for Research, Development and Training on Nuclear Science and Technology. So a very strong focus on the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology in a collaborative manner. Article 9 covers then the verification thereof, meaning the requirement that any state party should conclude a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA, but also a requirement there that prohibits the export or the supply of nuclear material and equipment that could be used in nuclear facilities, the prohibition of supply thereof to countries elsewhere in the world that do not have a CSA with the IAEA in force, which is to this day a limitation on, for instance, African uranium producers who are, through this Article 9, therefore prevented from, for instance, providing uranium to countries such as India and Pakistan, which is experienced by some countries now as a limitation and potentially an uneven playing field for the uranium market globally. Then Article 10, also going a bit further than some of the other weapon-free zone treaties on the physical protection of nuclear material and facilities. They have the emphasis on that. Article 11, again, unique to the Pelindaba Treaty, where the treaty prohibits an armed attack on nuclear installations of other state parties, or in any way would that be a conventional attack or even participation or supporting conventional or any other type of attack on nuclear installations in other countries is strongly, clearly prohibited. Article 12 then describes mechanisms for compliance of state parties to the provision of the treaty. And that includes the establishment of the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, AFCON, and we will hear more about that from the Executive Secretary a bit later. Article 13 then deals with reporting, for instance, annual reports to be submitted by state parties and signatories to the African Commission on Nuclear Energy. And the good news there is that in recent years, there's been a nice increase in the submission of the annual reports to the AFCON Secretariat. And then the next article dealing with the provisions of the arrangements for the Conference of State Parties, and then thereafter a whole number of the relatively the customary legal provisions. The annexes to the treaty, the first of them describes the territory, as we've discussed earlier, the continent of Africa with a whole range of islands, obviously including Madagascar, Mauritius, and those, and various other islands identified to be part of the African nuclear weapon free zone territory. Annex 2 deals with IAEA safeguards, how that should be done, and the way it should be conducted by the states in collaboration with the IAEA. Annex 3 prescribes the functioning of AFCON, things such as the appointment of 12 commissioners representing all the regions of the African continent for a period of 3 years, and various other ways of the operationalization of the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, including the Secretariat and the Bureau. Annex 4, dealing with handling of complaints and disputes should any state feel that another state is not playing the game, not meeting all its obligations. There, it prescribes mechanisms on how to deal with things such as that. Lastly, the 3 protocols to the treaty. The first 2 of them are for the nuclear weapon states, the 5 nuclear weapon states, for them to be signed and ratified. Protocol 1, in which these nuclear weapon states undertake not to use or to threaten to use nuclear explosive devices against any party to the Pelindaba Treaty. Protocol 2, where they undertake not to test or seek or give assistance in testing of nuclear explosive devices anywhere in the Pelindaba Treaty territory. So a strong obligation on the nuclear weapon states signing or ratifying these first 2 protocols, that they would be bound by the provisions of the Pelindaba Treaty as well. And then Protocol 3 is specifically applicable to France and Spain, the commitment that they should apply the Pelindaba Treaty provisions in territories of their de jure or de facto responsibility in and around the continent of Africa and in the field, in the territory of the treaty. So, in conclusion, certainly this African Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty presents a very strong platform for non-proliferation and also for Africa's development through the peaceful uses of nuclear technology. And I hope that this would have stimulated you to go and do some more homework on the treaty and its implementation. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. VA, for such a wonderful presentation. And thank you for putting down your email address so that if we want access to your presentation, we can get it, hopefully.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Next on our agenda is a presentation that is very close to my heart. It's by Ms. Adeline Uago. If you thought that the Pelindaba Treaty was only signed by men and there were no women involved in it, you are very wrong. Adeline's presentation will tell us about the role of women in the signing of Pelindaba Treaty and what we've been doing in the background. It's not all men. Women have been also playing in the field. So, a little about Adeline Uego. She's an engineer in industrial agro-food processes with a master's degree in the valorization and sustainable development of animal resources. Adeline entered the nuclear field 7 years ago when she started working for the National Radiation Protection Agency, where she is now the head of regulatory acts and prospective services. She is part of Win Global, Win Africa, BSWN, INMM, which is the Institute of Nuclear Materials Management, and serves as the partnership manager of Win Global Young Generation. She was recently nominated for one of the Win Global Awards. So the 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 if the voting begins, please vote for her because she deserves it. Her interest in gender equality led her to join a research group of women that contributed to the establishment and maintenance of the Pelindaba Treaty as part of her activities in Women in Nuclear Young Generation. This is exactly why she is the best person to tell us about what the women in Africa and the world over have done to bring forward the Pelindaba Treaty. So, Adeline, please, I will not take much of your time. I entreat you to start your presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you, Anima, for this brilliant introduction. And it's really impressive to present after such a great expert. But I will try my best. I don't know if you see my presentation.
Yes, you can see it is a very colorful presentation.
Okay, thank you. I would like to start by thanking Ms. Eva for inviting the Win Young Generation Research Team to present our work on the unsung role of women in establishing and sustaining the Pelindaba Treaty for an African nuclear weapon free zone. In the next 15 minutes, I will present the context, objective, and finding of our study, and it will be followed by a short summary before concluding. The role of women in nuclear issues has garnered significant attention across various organizations and countries in recent years. Numerous international organizations, non-profit, or governments and industries have adopted policies and initiatives that aim of advancing gender inclusivity in this field. And one of the prominent initiatives is the establishment of Women in Nuclear, who boasts more than 35,000 members from 60 chapters and from more than 145 countries. And one of the objectives of this meaningful organization was to attract more young in the nuclear field. That's why in 2021, in March, they launched the Women in Nuclear Young Generation Initiative. And within this section, there is a group of research team that realized that there is a growing body of literature acknowledging the role of women in the nuclear domain. However, there remains a dearth of literature exploring the role and impact of African women in the African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zones Treaty, and also known as the Treaties of Pelindaba. And his oversight body, the African Commission on Nuclear Energy. To date, scant recognition has been given to the contribution and impact of African female experts and practitioners on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament issues on the continent. And this issue has gained prominence in light of the global momentum to enhance gender balance in the nuclear. So that's why our research team decided to contribute by carrying out this study, which we hope we help to identify and comprehend the key female voices that have influenced the treaty's development, provide deeper insights into the contribution of various African subject matters, practitioners, and advocates in shaping nuclear non-proliferation norms and disarmament efforts in Africa through the Treaty of Pelindaba. And lastly, promote gender balance in nuclear discourse, decision-making, and policy-making. This study can be divided into three sections. The first section examines the key events and actors leading to its signing in 1996 in Cairo, and the next one would present the actors that have been involved in culminating its entry into force in 2009. And for the last section, we did an interview with Mr. Hubert Ford, the director and founder of the African Center for Science and International Security, AFRICSIS. With him, we reviewed the women's involvement in non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament verification. Also, we complete the work by conducting a comprehensive survey of young African professionals in the nuclear industry to assess their perception and opinions of the Pelindaba Treaty and its role in nuclear security in African countries. But this last section will not be used here, but we will have the opportunity to read about it in our, you will have the opportunity to read about it in our forthcoming article. However, in the course of preparing this webinar, I've learned a number of interesting things that I would like to share with you as much as possible, given the time constraints. So now we are in the grassroots activism, who took place from 1960s to 1980s. At that time, there was a nuclear program in development in South Africa and Ghana, and France was conducting nuclear testing in the Sahara, just as I said, the professor. So the Sahara protest team demonstrated in November 1959 until 1960. It was made up of 10 Africans activists, or more than 10 African. We have actually 10 Ghanaians, a Mosoto, a Nigerian, who was joined by 2 Americans, 3 Britons, and a French woman. That French woman is Esther Peter Davis, the only woman in the Sahara team. And they together they raise international awareness of the impact of nuclear testing in Africa. Evelyn Amatefio is an Ghanaian feminist who founded the Ghana Federation of Gold Coast Women, which supported the Ghana Nuclear Disarmament Council launched by Bill Sutherland. And she also, by this, contributed in building grassroots support for nuclear disarmament in Ghana. You have to remember the name of this Bill Sutherland because he is the husband of Efia Tuedaha Sutherland, and famous author and cultural activist. And she was married to Bill, and who is an African-American civil rights and anti-war activist, a member of the Sahara team and the key figure of the GLDC initiative. And together at his side, they garnered to significant support from notable public figures and organizations within Ghana, including the Ghana Women's Federation I've been talking about just few moments before. And we have Ursula Damsey, who led Namibia's All Africans Women's Freedom Movement, which launched demonstrations against South Africa's nuclear weapons program, drawing over 5,000 women in 1982. Can you imagine women at that time, without social media, being able to attract that number of people? It's just amazing. In this grassroots activism, we cannot forget to talk about these 2 South African anti-apartheid activists and political figures and friends, Albertina Sisulu and Winnie Mandela, who was prominent voices against the apartheid government's nuclear weapons program, and they highlight the disproportionate impact of nuclear testing on indigenous populations. that really help in building grassroots support for nuclear disarmament. The grassroots activism will be closed with the profile of Wangari Maathai, a Kenyan social, environmental, and political activist who founded the Green Belt movement, an environmental NGO focusing on tree planting, environmental conservation, and women's rights. In 2004, she became the first African woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Green Belt movement, which organized mass campaigns against nuclear weapon-free zones, against nuclear weapons across sub-Saharan Africa, arguing that environmental justice was linked to nuclear abolition. She mobilized widespread public support for a nuclear weapon-free Africa. She was also the first woman in East Central Africa to be awarded a Doctor of Philosophy degree from the University of Nairobi in Kenya. And in 1984, she received the Right Livelihood Award. She was also winner of the Goldman Prize, and she has writing several books. I will give you the opportunity to learn more about her another time. We now enter in the treaties negotiation phase that lasts between 1990 and 1996. It started when the Declaration for the Denuclearization of Africa was presented at the plenary of the 54th session of the United Nations in 1990, explicitly requesting support for the realization of a convention of treaty for the denuclearization of the continent. In May 1991, experts met in Addis Ababa, including Ms. Liberata Mulamula, to discuss implementing a convention or treaty for Africa's denuclearization. She is a Tanzanian diplomat who participated in expert meeting, and she discussed implementing a treaty for Africa's denuclearization. She contributed to the building of consensus of key aspects of the treaty, including its administration and coverage. That's why she has been part of the second consultation phase that have been held in Lomé in April 1992, and also in the final meeting that has been held in Senegal in June 1992. And in the Harare meeting, the expert group found themselves engaged in discussion to clarify and refine the elements for the treaty rather than negotiate the text of the treaty. And Ms. Liberata Mulamula was reappointed in this meeting as one of the only 3 national members who participated. So her contribution closely with the representative of other African states and international partners was to address concern, build consensus, and draft the treaty text itself. She is a recognized local, regional, and international leader with over 25 years of experience. She's the founding member of FemWise Africa. She's also the founding, let me see. She's also the founding of the African Union. A moment, please. She also aims to strengthen the role of women in conflict prevention and mediation in the context of African peace and security. The second figure that we have to captivate our attention in the treaties negotiation phase is Ambassador Joy Ogbu, the Nigeria's top envoy on nuclear non-proliferation. She's a renowned globally as Iron Lady of Africa, and was that appointed female diplomat proved indispensable to reconciling competing strategic interests and achieving consensus on the landmark Pelindaba Treaty in 1994 as Nigeria's top envoy on nuclear non-proliferation. Agu was tasked with engaging heads of state across Africa to build support for nuclear weapon ban treaty. She played a crucial role in overcoming initial resistance and achieving consensus on the Pelindaba Treaty. She has recently retired as ambassador and permanent representative of the Federal Republic of Nigeria to the United Nations. She served as Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Federal Republic of Nigeria between 2006 and 2007. I don't want to be too long, but there is a lot of things to say about these amazing ladies. What I can pick from now is just saying that she led, recently she led in 2012, she led the 193 member states of the UN to adopt a landmark consensus outcome document. And there is a book writing about this impactful action that she made during this career. And she is the chair of the special committees of peacemaking operations. I encourage you to read a lot about this amazing and inspiring role model. We're now entering in the treaties awareness and advocacy phase with the first female chairperson of the African Union. I'm talking about Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. So the treaty awareness advocacy phase took place between 1996 and 2009, and she, as the first female chairperson of the organization, she has been in the trenches fighting for the liberation of South Africa, and she is an undisputed trailblazer in the upliftment, and empowerment of women across the African continent, and also champion African development in her illustrious careers of serving people. And as the first female leader of the Continental Organization elected in 2012, she committed herself to peace and development of the continent and signed the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, AFCON, the Pelindaba Treaty Implementation Agency, host agreement for the establishment of its headquarters. She worked to have all states ratify and accede to the treaty and its protocol as the depository, provided visionary oversight and commitment to upholding the treaty standards as the depository. I will also continue by telling that she is a recipient of numerous honorary degrees and awards, just as her previous, just as Dr. Ogu also did. I forgot to mention that. We are closing the treaties awareness and advocacy phase with Amina Jane Mohammed, who is a Nigerian British diplomat who is serving as the 5th Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Previously, she was Nigerian Minister on Environment from 1915 to 1960 and was a player in the post-2015 development agenda process. She's also chair of United Nations Sustainable Development Group. Amina Mohammed is the first female chair of the IAEA Board of Governors. She secured the agency's formal cooperation with Africa's nuclear-free zones in 2009 and raising the continent's profile and influence. She has been conferred several honorary doctorates and has served as an adjunct professor lecturing on international development. The recipient of various global awards, Ms. Mohammed has served on numerous international advisory boards and panels. Now, after this run, we have now the little summary. About the grassroots activism, we can understand that the germination of the Pelindaba Treaty took root in grassroots nuclear disarmament campaigns across Africa in the 1960s to 80s, often spearheaded by a group of audacious women. And during the 60s to 80s, all women played an essential role in anti-nuclear weapon activism, organizing mass protests, and advocating for nuclear abolition. The treaty's negotiation and advocacy phase. Through his impassioned organizing and messaging, African women activists powerfully demonstrate that nuclear disarmament was an urgent priority, with widespread grassroots support across the continent, influencing African leaders to consider a nuclear weapon ban treaty. We will close this presentation with the quote of Ambassador Professor Ogo, telling that the Pelindaba Treaty's very existence is a testament to the African women who have struggled relentlessly in the background and whose consummate diplomacy finally transformed nuclear abolition from dream into reality. Across all phases of governance, female leaders have ensured the Pelindaba Treaty not only endures on papers, but retains its potency and relevance as Africa's defense against nuclear threats. Through their visionary oversight and principled commitment to upholding Pelindaba's standards, African women remain the foremost guardians, preserving and strengthening the nuclear weapon-free zone they helped create. These inspiring women leave us a legacy that resonates in the minds of the young generation that we are. So they teach us that we can do it. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Adeline. How wonderful your presentation was. I'm going to be personally biased and say that I'm especially proud to see two Ghanaian ladies, Dr. Amatefio and Dr. Sutherland, in the list of women activists who fought for the Pelindaba Treaty to become a reality. I'm super proud. And I'm also happy to see other well known women like Dr. Zuma and others. Wangari Matai. Oh, how wonderful. Thank you so much for your expose.
Thank
And I
you.
hope that we all strive as women and even men on this webinar to also make our light shine in our own small ways. Next on our agenda is the AFCON's history, mission, its main provisions, and the current status. It will be presented by Enobot Agboro, who is the Executive Secretary of the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, AFCON. He previously worked at the International Atomic Energy Agency for 32 years, that's a long time, in various roles, including safeguards and the nuclear fuel cycle development. He advocates for a multilateral approach to addressing Africa's energy poverty to, in, to contribute to Africa's energy agenda 2063. I am personally privileged to have met Enobot Agboro in 2023 during the US Africa Energy Summit and the IFNEC Summit in Accra. Let me tell you, he is so easy to approach and easy to talk to. So, Mr. Enobot, can you please help us with the AFCON? We are ready to hear from you.
Thank you, Anima. It's good to see you again. Around the virtual table, let me start by thanking Win for Peace for inviting me to this very important webinar. And before I get into my main presentation, I'd like to benefit from the slipstream of the previous speaker to add to what she said about the involvement in women in the Pelindaba Treaty and its implementation, particularly on the African continent. AFCON, the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, which means that it is the organ of the treaty that is responsible for the day-to-day implementation of the provisions of the treaty to achieve its objectives. AFCON was established in July, 15th of July, 2009. That is the day that the 28th country in Africa ratified the Treaty of Pelindaba. 28 is an important number because in accordance with the treaty, it will come into force when a simple majority of African countries ratify the treaty. Since there are 55 countries, or there were 55 countries in Africa at the time, a simple majority would be 28, because 27 times 2 would be 54, and that would not be a majority of countries. So when the 28th country ratified the treaty, it entered into force in July of 2009. So this month is actually the anniversary of the entry into force of the Treaty of Pelindaba and the establishment of the African Commission on Nuclear Energy. When the treaty entered into force and AFCON was established in 2009, there was no AFCON secretariat to implement the treaty. There was no AFCON headquarters, there was no AFCON office anywhere. So since the chairperson of the African Union is the depository of the treaty, AFCON was initially hosted at the African Union in Addis Ababa from 2009. The secretariat, which is AFCON, was actually established in reality in 2016. So between 2009 and 2016, when the secretariat of AFCON was established and AFCON was hosted at the African Union in Addis Ababa, the AU assigned one person to manage the affairs of AFCON for those years. And that one person was a woman. For the first 7 years of AFCON, the person managing the affairs of AFCON at the African Union was a woman called Inis Mohammed, a Sudanese expert who's currently working for UNODA, the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. And in 2015, when Dr. Zuma was the chairperson of the African Union Commission, she facilitated the host agreement between AFCON and the government of South Africa to host the Secretariat of AFCON in South Africa, where our offices are currently located. And right now in the AFCON Secretariat, we have a gender balance of staff. 50% of our staff are women, and we are striving to maintain that gender balance as we move forward. So I will now go back to the main topic of the presentation and start with the history of AFCON. In 1964, in July of 1964, the 17th to the 21st of July of that year, was the first ever summit of African heads of government. The Organization of African Union was created in 1963, and a year later, in 1964, July, in Cairo, was the first ever summit of heads of state. And it is at that summit, the first ever of African heads of state, that they took the resolution for the denuclearization of Africa. So the origins of AFCON are emanating from the first time, the very first time, that African heads of government got together. Nuclear was on the agenda. And that is significant, I think. And we are now in 2024, in July. The anniversary of that first ever summit in Cairo will be next week, on the 17th of July this year. That would be 60 years. 60 years is normally called the Diamond Jubilee. The Diamond Jubilee is significant because people believe that the Diamond Jubilee is the beginning of the golden years. So I believe that this year, 2024, the 60th anniversary of the Cairo Declaration, will mark the beginning of the golden years for the advancement of non-proliferation, disarmament, and the utilization of peaceful applications of nuclear science and technology and industrial and socio-economic. Our continent is currently suffering a severe energy deficit and towards nuclear power or energy sources to resolve this energy poverty on the continent. Now, what is AFCON, African Commission on Nuclear Energy? Like we've heard from other speakers, it is the African intergovernmental organization that was created by the Treaty of Pelindaba, and it's mandated to foster industrial and socioeconomic development in Africa through the promotion of the peaceful applications of nuclear science and technology. It is also mandated to promote regional and international cooperation towards the peaceful applications of nuclear science and technology. And the third mandate of AFCON is to promote peace and security in Africa and globally through ensuring the implementation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty of Pelindaba. AFCON has 4 organs. The Conference of State Parties to the Treaty of Pelindaba is the first organ. This is the group of countries that are parties to the treaty. That is, countries that have either ratified the treaty or have acceded to the treaty. There are currently 44 of them out of the 55 countries in Africa. The Conference of State Parties is the supreme governance organ of AFCON. It is responsible for adopting the budget. It is responsible for adopting the program of work. It is responsible for interpreting the treaty, is responsible for revising the treaty if need be, and I think there is a need to do that. And it is responsible for considering all matters related to the implementation of the treaty. is the supreme body in AFCON. The other organ of AFCON is the Secretariat, where I am the head. The Secretariat is responsible for the day-to-day functioning of the organization AFCON, for implementing the provisions of the treaty in order to achieve the objectives that I spoke about. Then we have the AFCON Commission, which is like equivalent to a board. Consists of 12 members, and these 12 members representing 12 African countries from all the different regions of Africa are responsible for strategic oversight of the implementation of the program of work approved by the Conference of State Parties that is being implemented by the Secretariat. Now, within, I'll just make a little clarification here. The organization itself is called the African Commission on Nuclear Energy. And within the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, there is an organ called the AFCON Commission. They are not the same thing. It's important to keep that in mind. So in carrying out their responsibility of strategic oversight of what the Secretariat is doing, 12 commissioners all contacting the Secretariat at the same time. So there's an arrangement whereby the 12 commissioners appoint or elect from among themselves 2 people, a chairman and a vice chairman of the AFCON Commission. And these 2 people, the chair and the vice chair, together with the executive secretary from the Secretariat, form a group called the AFCON Bureau. So this is like the embassy from the AFCON Commission to the AFCON Secretariat. And it's a forum for sharing information so that state parties are kept informed that the program of work is being implemented as was adopted. So let me now speak about the membership of the Treaty of Pelindaba. I said that there are 44 African countries that are state parties. But African countries are not the only countries that are eligible to be parties to the treaty. The nuclear weapon states are also eligible to be parties to the treaty. The treaty has 3 protocols, as Dr. Van Sale spoke about in his presentation. And the main thing about these protocols is for the nuclear weapon states in Protocol 1 and in Protocol 2 to provide assurances to African countries, negative security assurances that they will not use nuclear weapons on the territory or territories of the African nuclear weapon-free zone, and they will not test nuclear weapons in Africa. I need some revision, because if you look at the treaty, you will see that the treaty talks about peaceful uses, it talks about safeguards, it talks about, and because of that, the IAEA is indicated, is in fact actually specified in the treaty. Cooperation with the IAEA on safeguards, cooperation with the IAEA through AFRA on technical cooperation. But the treaty also talks about, the treaty also forbids nuclear weapon testing. But when the treaty was being negotiated, the CTBTO did not exist. The CTBTO exists right now. So I think if there were going to be a revision of the treaty, then the CTBTO will be specifically mentioned in the treaty. And there are other examples like this that I won't go into them right now. So Dr. Van Zyl also spoke about how special the Treaty of Pelindaba is. Indeed, it's special in many ways compared to the other treaties for the other weapon-free zones. It is the only treaty that specifically calls for encouraging the creation of new weapon-free zones in other parts of the world. You'll find this in the preamble of the treaty. It is the only treaty that calls for the destruction of nuclear weapons and the infrastructure for developing nuclear weapons. It's the only treaty that forbids the attacks on nuclear facilities in the zones of the treaty. Article 9 on import and particularly export of nuclear materials and equipment that are especially designed for the nuclear fuel cycle. African countries, for example, uranium producers like Namibia and Niger cannot export uranium to countries that do not have a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA. This is let me say, an economic challenge for those African countries, particularly considering that the NSG gave a waiver to exports to India. So, and I think most importantly, from the point of view of the Secretariat, is that the African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone is the only one with a Secretariat to implement the provisions of the treaty. The other zones do not have secretariats. And something that's also special about the AFCON Secretariat is that we can establish our own inspectorate you'll see that in the annexes, to be able to verify compliance with the provisions of the treaty. At the moment, we do not have an inspectorate, and that's because largely due to funding challenges. But in the future, the AFCON Secretariat would have its own inspectorate with inspectors like the IAEA, verifying compliance with the provisions of the treaty, which are very broad. Our provisions are not only limited to safeguards, they include disarmament, they include nuclear security. You will find that there are references to nuclear safety in the preamble of the treaty. So it includes waste. There's, I think, it's Article 7 that speaks about the Bamako Convention. So it's a very broad treaty in terms of scope, and I'm very much looking forward to the future date when we will have the capacity to fully implement it on the continent and by extension, fostering peace and security throughout the world. So at the moment, how do we implement it? We have a reporting template that is shared with state parties to report their nuclear material inventories and their nuclear activities. And we use that to judge whether they are in compliance with the provisions of the treaty, mainly the provisions between Articles 3 and Article 11. We also cooperate with the IAEA in terms of looking at the annual safeguards implementation report, which reports on how African countries have implemented their commitments under safeguards agreements. And we use that as input to seeing how, to what extent our state parties have complied. We also use data from CTBTO data centers and information from open sources in our assessment to what extent the state parties to the treaty have complied with the provisions of the treaty. And we report on this to us on 2 years. Like I said, we also promote regional and international cooperation. So we enter into partnerships with stakeholders in the nuclear landscape, international organizations, foreign countries. We conclude memoranda of understandings on issues that are relevant to the treaty. We also try to get African countries to cooperate between themselves in the development of the nuclear fuel cycle. Last year, we made connections between some African countries on the supply of medical radioisotopes for medical diagnosis, cancer treatment. We've also organized cooperation between African countries and African private sector and foreign countries on the utilization of nuclear technologies for food security, irradiation technologies, for climate resilient agriculture, and things like that. We are also engaged in partnerships on the back end of the fuel cycle. You know, when nuclear power particularly was being developed in, the currently developed countries, I say currently because Africa is also going to be fully developed in future, if we do our due diligence in implementing Agenda 2063. When these countries were developing nuclear power, they did not think very much about the back end, what to do with the waste or decommissioning and that sort of thing related to the back end. So now that over a dozen African countries are embarking towards nuclear power and more are going to be moving in that direction, AFCON is positioning itself to be able to advise African countries on the back end of the fuel cycle, particularly to do with decommissioning and the final disposal of spent fuel, which is considered as high-level radioactive waste. We also involved in capacity building. We have a program with the European Union and the Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority of Finland, STUK, is collaborating with us to implement this program in Africa. It is the first capacity building program in the nuclear space in Africa that you can say is owned and managed by an African organization. And your president of Win for Peace, Ms. Vajiane, is one of our lecturers, and Dr. Van Sale is one of the experts on this program. And last year, we trained 15 African countries. And the cohort for this year is 13 countries. It's a 5-year program, and we hope that by the end of the 5 years, we would have trained all of the 55 countries in Africa. And in terms of technical expertise, all African countries will have the full competency and capacity to implement their safeguards and non-proliferation obligations. But the business of nuclear is not limited to technical people or to what we call practitioners, because what the practitioners do is driven from the policy level. So next year, we are going to be expanding our program. We're going to be introducing a summer course for African government officials and diplomats who are involved in multilateral affairs. And so that we will build capacity, across the, let me say, spectrum of society, from high-level policy to technician level of implementation. And we're also we are working with other partners to introduce nuclear education in Africa from the vocational level right through to the graduate level. So these are the things that we do. We participate in regional and international conferences so that Africa's voice can be heard, so that African perspectives can be considered, so that we can also be equal players in the development of nuclear energy in the world. I spoke about the parties to the treaty. I spoke about African countries and nuclear weapon states. There's a third tier of countries that are also eligible to be parties to the treaty. And these are countries that are responsible for territories that are considered by the African Union to be on the African territory. In law, they say they have de jure or de facto responsibility for territories in Africa. There are 2 countries in that category. There's France and there's Spain. And both of them have an obligation to get those territories to conclude safeguards agreements with the IAEA. And they also have responsibilities to get those countries to cooperate with AFCON in the implementation of the Treaty of Pelindaba. There's so much to talk about what AFCON does, but I think I've exhausted my 15 minutes by about 5 minutes. So I'm going to stop here, and if there's anything else, I will address it in the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you too so much, Mr. Agboro. That was eye-opening, and I'm so happy that Africa so far is the only secretariat with an office. We are serious about our work. And I'm also happy about the numbers of women in the commission. So thank you for such an eye-opening expose. Please stay online. I'm sure some people have questions for you. So we are going to proceed right now into our Q&A session. Please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box or in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen so that we can see your questions and answer all of them. So, all our participants, please come online so we can have a Q&A session right now. I've seen a number of questions that have been directed. So please let me ask them on behalf of the people who wrote them. One second, please. So this goes to Razan. Razan, how can the international community effectively address the challenges of the nuclear weapon free zone's entry into force, especially with respect to the countries that have not signed on yet?
Thank you, Anima, for this question. You know that establishment and implementation of nuclear weapon-free zones present a significant challenges. Um, of course, it's, more particularly for countries that have not signed the treaty yet. I think some way of addressing it could be through diplomatic efforts, regional cooperation, or international support. From my point of view, the role of international organizations like the United Nations or the IAEA can play a role by providing technical or diplomatical or logistical support. So,
Thank you for your answer. It
you're welcome.
completely exhausts the question. And Mr. Van Zyl, there's a question for you here. It says, Libya's nuclear weapon program was only disclosed in late 2003. Were there any lessons learned from this failure to detect Libya's efforts earlier?
That's an interesting one. Yes, I think it's unlikely because I mean the Pelindaba Treaty only entered into force, even though it was open for signature from 1995. It only entered into force in 2009, meaning that should there have been any suspicions or indications of a program, yes, the treaty not being into force at the time yet, meaning before 2009, I think there was not really, I think the IAEA and other international organizations were then at the time the suitable vehicle, the African Commission on Nuclear Energy was as if not yet operational. So I think that's what, as I mentioned, that the fact that the Libyan program basically got known before the entry into force, in a way, accelerated or made it easier for states to join and for the treaty to enter into force. So yeah, I think for Libya it was case of other international mechanisms, IAEA and so forth, were then the ones who could actually identify that and then work with Libya and with others to have it dismantled and closed down.
Okay. Thank you so much for your answer. Next question is going to Mr. Enobot Agboro. It says, what information do the AFCON member states provide in their annual reports? Does AFCON share this information with the IAEA or they just share it to the African Union?
If you look at the treaty, Articles 3 to Articles 11 are the obligations that countries have undertaken. So in the questionnaire, the reporting questionnaire that we have provided to state parties, they provide information on all those articles. But principally, they provide information about the inventories of nuclear material that they hold in the country, as well as the nuclear activities that they are undertaking in the country. They also have the possibility to speak about anything that they feel concerned about or anything that they feel is important to them in the nuclear landscape. We don't share this information with the IAEA, but we get information from the IAEA that we add to the information that our state parties provide to us,
That's
because
interesting.
the treaty says that we cannot share information that state parties provide unless the state party specifically allows us to do that. So we do not share the details of the information, but we report the conclusions of our assessment of that information. We report it to the Conference of State Parties to the Treaty of Pelindaba, because AFCON report to the Conference of State Parties, the 44 countries that are parties to the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is a personal question before the final question, which is directed to Van Zyl. In light of some of the African countries that have conflicts in them, are they affecting the rollout of or the implementation of the Treaty of Pelindaba as a whole? And in what way? And what are you doing to assuage this?
We are not involved in conflict resolution,
Okay.
as in insurgency and civil unrest in countries.
Okay.
That is a responsibility of the African Union Commission, specifically the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security. And we work very closely with them in terms of sharing information and collaborating on areas where our responsibilities overlap. So we provide support, but it's not our direct responsibility. But so far, conflict, strife, unrest in African countries, luckily, has so far not had any adverse impact on the implementation of the Treaty of Pelindaba in Africa, because at the moment, our implementation is mostly based on paperwork.
Okay.
We don't yet have actual inspectors.
Inspectorate.
I hope that you will be one of our inspectors in the
I'm
future.
always ready to.
And, when that happens, we will have challenges in terms of travel and security issues. Thank you.
Is that an open invitation?
Let's say that it is.
Okay. Okay, then I openly accept. Okay, the final question,
You're
Mr.
welcome.
V. It says, is Russia a signatory to the Pelindaba Treaty, given that it has occupied a Ukrainian nuclear weapon, Ukrainian nuclear power plant? In a case where a country is not a signatory and they go into war with another country that has nuclear installations, what happens?
Yes. Firstly, Russia has ratified protocols 1 and 2 to the Pelindaba Treaty, which obviously binds them to all the provisions of the treaty, including non-aggression, non-attack of nuclear installations in Pelindaba Treaty territory. So that means that obviously what Russia does elsewhere and whether Ukraine or elsewhere falls outside the provisions of the Pelindaba Treaty. Should something like that obviously happen in the territory of the treaty, then I think it is Annex 4 specifically provides for ways to handle that then. Yeah, so they are the provisions in the treaty to deal with possible infringements on the obligations and by any of the signatories. But yeah, so for Russia, their their, let's call it, their obligations in terms of the Pelindaba Treaty only covers the territory of the treaty.
Okay. Oh, Mr. Van Zyl, I think you are popular here because someone just asked another question. He or she says, what will experienced Africans like Dr. Van Zyl do, or what are they doing now to encourage women participation in nuclear non-proliferation? So tell us a personal story, what you are doing.
Wow. Well, firstly, through my participation in AFCON affairs, such as the safeguards related training that Mr. Akbora has mentioned. So yeah, I mean, and also even though I was roped into this at short notice, it's to me a great pleasure to participate in this one, in this event. So yeah, wherever I go, I think before, during my time at the IAEA, obviously I was in full support of the initiatives of the Director General, DG Grossi, in that regard, and certainly I try my best also to in my interactions with AFCON member states and through AFCON activities and the work of the Secretariat, I try my best to spread the message that nuclear is good and interesting and a rewarding career.
Yes.
And certainly there's a lot of space and opportunities for ladies such as yourselves. And it was, I looked at the participants, and it was great to see a few known names there and many others that I hope would be inspired by the discussions today and also by this webinar series of Wonderful Peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's good to know you are doing something to help us ladies come on stage. This is my personal request. I'd entreat you to smile into the camera. I want to post you on LinkedIn on our page. So please give us your brightest smile. If your camera is off, please put it on so that you can take part. Are you ready? Ready, set, go. Done. Okay.
Good.
So don't be surprised if I post you on LinkedIn and I tag you. This has been a wonderful, wonderful, eye opening webinar. Please follow our social media handles for more information. If you want the recording of this webinar, please, you find it on the Win Global page on YouTube. We have everything there. The questions and answers will be posted in the comment section. So thank you so much. We entreat you to join us next month for the next session. The next session will not necessarily be on the nuclear weapon free zones. We have other interesting topics, but we'll let you know when the second in the series of the nuclear weapon CNBTs are posted. So, any final words from you, Eva?
Thank you, Anima. Thank you. A big, big thank you to all the speakers, to the moderator, to the excellent moderation of this webinar. I'm really proud of you all, the way you just spoke very, very inspiringly to all of us. So thank you to all those young ladies, and thank you to my dear former colleagues. I think everybody enjoyed this webinar. It was very insightful. I myself, I thought I knew a lot, but I've still learned a lot of new things about the
Yeah.
Pelindaba Treaty and about AFCON and about how things work. And I would just like to have a big applause for all of you. I'm really proud of you, and thank you. Good job, ladies.
Have a
Thank you,
have a
Fanti.
great
Thank you,
weekend,
Ingo.
everybody.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy yourselves and relax and watch the recording on YouTube.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank you very much.
you.
Meantime,
Thank you
if
all.
you're a
Great
woman,
weekend to all.
you can submit your abstract to the Women in Nuclear Global Conference. It's happening in Mexico. So get your abstracts ready. You can apply for the IAEA funding and take part.